alternate reality simulation stress-tested responses to realistic challenges ranging from climate disasters to mass migrations. City officials, members of the development community, and local media representatives were put to the test in Bangkok, Beirut, Harare, Hanoi, Khartoum, Mexico City, and Yerevan.
The Synthesis Center at Arizona State University, which I direct, is somewhere between an art studio and a science lab, an engineering lab. It's an atelier. And in one sentence, what we do is to find ways to make our environments richer, but not more complicated. And all sorts of ways, ranging from arts, performing arts, to architecture and technology. So how do we do that? And what do we draw from? It's all coming around this focus on life experience. So we're really interested in this condition of people being together at the same time at the same place. Of course, with COVID these days, a lot of times that's going to be in different places, but still this idea is around live experience and kind of live event. And we can take technologies, computer technologies especially, to make a picture, make a story, but really what we're interested in is using these technologies to enable people to make sense of our lives together ourselves, right? And also to make these kinds of environments where we actually do that kind of collective imagination, this kind of prototyping of life, or prototyping of other ways to make our built environment. And in particular, one of these kinds of ways where we've been doing this is to look at alternate reality simulations, inspired by alternate reality games. But the really important thing here is to think of them as structured conversations. It's a way for very carefully to construct a setup where people can come together in a network platform to play out various fictive scenarios, fictive situations. The key thing here, we call it a simulation rather than a game, is that it's not about some abstract artificial goals. It's, in this case, we ask people to come, we say to you, play yourselves, bring in your experiences and your values and your norms and politics. But we're going to place ourselves in a fictive setting, a what-if setting. Okay? And that's the form that we're trying to build and adapt for this work with the UNDP.
I would like to begin by sharing a link on the chat room. This link gets you directly into the interface that we designed explicitly to be accessible all across the globe through a web browser. The local office has prepared a whole template to run the simulation in order to make it easy for the facilitators and also advance the narrative of actually building these scenarios and understand more what the simulation can do. We implemented a save and load function. So I'll copy this gibberish from here and load the simulation. And that gives me some layouts. Some layouts that we prepare before as a template. You see the mayor, the bank, the school, the energy sector, police, and UNDP, all sharing resources. These resources are mobile capital, human resources, and fixed capital, and they reflect an abstraction of capital of resources of value that is regional. And it's an abstraction of a percentage that we then distribute to each of these entities. So we see here that the mayor has 10 points, which is average of 10%, let's say, of mobile capital, 21 of the human resources, and 20 of fixed capital, and so on and so forth. During the play, the players have a one simple game mechanic, like simulation mechanic, which is to formulate some what-if statements, which are novel ways of addressing issues and trying to think in an integrated way how to tackle chronic and different other challenges that occur within a city setting within the simulation. So I'll start right now. And this is our interface. It has the institutions and everything is clickable. So you click and you read what is the institution, is UNDP, police, energy, school, bank, and the mayor. We have the chronic condition here that says that it's the COVID era and all the challenges around. If I click any of these white cells, the panel.
And I am placing right now my what if with mobile capital of 10 and human resources 15. And we are immediate response SAR operations, search and rescue. Surveillance devices like UAVs are sent out to monitor the coverage. And of course, I will set for telecom company once their services are restored to connect to the people, and we will require creation of immediate as possible. Or I don't know, we can launch the application, which we presume to have an application of marking them safe or marking them needing assistance application from the citizens. So I'm placing another step for telecom company, and we will see the rest.
Dear civilian, please speak up.
Yeah, I've posted on this board demanding emergency situation and press to inform citizens what to do. Mm-hmm. And also I'm asking the Ministry of Health to do to place like spots even in the streets with all the masks and everything needed for people to take, so not to forget the air pollution problem from the first round, so that we don't have the crisis doubled if possible. So I don't know are there hotlines that we can call? Are there emergency helping spots in the streets or in the communities that people can go to?
That gap to develop maybe smart water metering facilities so as to increase revenue, but also making sure that people pay what they actually use for what they actually use, but also to enhance water efficiency and saving of water. Then also maybe coming up with different tariffs for the use, for example, of water between low density and high density, right? So that the city can actually utilize that opportunity at least to increase some revenue and also give value in terms of, especially for the low density, for the high density, where already these are already vulnerable communities. So at least they can benefit from that arrangement. These are just my thoughts, but I'm not an economist. I don't really understand the impact. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our Water Authority for the final remarks. Much appreciated. And I know you said I'm not an economist, but then this is the reason why we are all here as a group, so that we get a different perspective. So that's good that we're hearing your perspective. We also get to hear some thoughts from local government, the Women's Bank, the police. And really, if you look at the conversation that we've had this whole afternoon, you see that we started off with this scenario of saying, should we have our vendors going back to the streets in this lockdown scenario, going back to the streets, and if they go back, what precautions need to be done? And we all went on to explore an alternative scenario. We were saying, what are the other realities out there that could come up, say, instead of them going back to the streets, what could they be doing? And then we moved on to look at these shocks in the system that we analyzed, looking at the wetland farming, and then going on to tackle the idea of having to choose, because we might be having as a city a lot of challenges, and we need to choose maybe one or two to prioritize, and then having to face the implications of choosing one to address one challenge over another with this mobile money crash, and then ending with the idea that, okay, what if we have a something that would pop out to most people's minds is a positive, great thing to jump on. But however, from the discussion, we're seeing that we need to take a step back as decision makers, as a city, and see even what's regarded as a great positive could have certain limitations.
And in our case, working with UNDP, we're looking at examples of social forms that we can prototype, which could be, what's a social form? It could be a meal. So that's a social form. It could be a home. Everybody knows what a home is. Even if you're homeless, you have some sense of what a home is. And then in the largest sense that we have here, city. And the question is, how do we run a city in this fictive scenario? We're saying to people now, we gather you together, it's 2022, COVID's still an issue, and in the meanwhile, your city's economy has become more brittle. It's become more dependent on mobile technologies, more dependent on internet, more dependent on digital techniques, which are all brittle.
Welcome to the Movement 3, Accelerating Development and its Future, in a session focusing on modeling for interconnected and transboundary risks. Anybody knows any of those? Here we speak to a group of colleagues who straddle academic and policy realms about new ways in which societies can stress test their institutional resilience to respond to emerging risks, something we've all been quite familiar with recently. You will hear today from Shinwei Shah, who is a professor in the School of Arts, Media and Engineering at Arizona State University. He directs the Synthesis Center for Responsive Environments and Improvisation. Sander van der Loo is a foundation professor at Arizona State University too, and co-director of the ASU SFI Center for Biosocial Complex Systems. And finally, Ida Usukula, UNDP Vietnam Country Office Innovation Focal Point. Before I turn to the speakers, let me just say why at UNDP and for the broader UN family and other international partners, this topic of today's session is so extremely important. One cannot assume we know what the path to achieving the sustainable development goals actually is. And while we know what the targets we want to achieve are, the success of reaching them will actually depend on our ability to imagine alternative futures, meaning different scenarios that lead to these SDG targets, but also different qualities of the situation where we may find ourselves in 2030. Now, imagining is not enough. We need to model, and we need to be ready to manage crises and risks as they come along. The COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example. Governments, municipalities, businesses, and individuals all had to readjust their view of the future, and those with more agility succeeded. For UNDP, this means rethinking how to plan, program, and implement the work, how to engage with partners and donors, how to train staff, and actually which people to hire for the teams of the future. During my time with UNDP in Armenia, I saw firsthand how resilience to emerging risks is a make it or break it for a country on a path of ambitious reforms, and how we as a UNDP country office needed some completely new approaches to support Armenia in the critical and complex time. So for me, this session is really interesting personally, and I'm really looking forward to learning from our panel on the why, the what, and the how of modeling and managing alternative futures. Dr. Shah, we at UNDP have never done anything of the nature or scale of alternative reality simulations that we collaborate on in 7 cities. Judging by the video, colleagues and partners did not hate it. What made you comfortable to take a leap of faith with UNDP on this collaboration?
We shared, and we share, I think, a lot of common ground on the challenges we face when we're trying to deal with complexity, right? This is also why my colleague Sander is here today as well. So complexity meaning it's going to yield surprises and indeterminacy. And no matter how well we plan, how carefully we measure things, how well we model, there's always going to be surprises. So that's one of the common I think, starting points for us. Not that they're not necessary, they're necessary, but they're not adequate. Okay. Another is this issue of wicked problems and how to deal with wicked problems, and something that, at least in the academic side, my colleagues and I have been facing and thinking about for quite a long time, of course. But in the field, this is what people deal with on a day-to-day basis, which is what UNDP deals with on a daily basis, right? So the question is, for example, common ground on thinking that maybe magic bullet solutions are not solutions at all, but magic bullets can cause more wicked problems of their own. And that one of my favorites is this fact that the people who are trying to solve wicked problems may themselves be part of the problem. And this is something that I use to remind myself and my colleagues who are experts in this or that maybe we could be part of the problem, but we can't actually detach ourselves from that. So working with the UNDP was the opportunity to bring it back in, put this all back into the field and into practice and see what we can do together. And finally, when I got to meet the country office colleagues that you brought together early on from these different cities who will be participating, I was tremendously impressed with the experience and the dedication of the people there. And I say this completely frankly, and there's something pretty inspiring to work with the people in these offices. Really.
Dr. Shah, thank you very much. My next question is a bit more general. You're leading Synthesis Center at the Arizona State. Can you tell us about the type of work that the center does?
But in words, what we've been doing now for many years is building what we call responsive environments. So responsive environments means you walk around in the space, you are walking, talking, or perhaps performing. And the space itself, what you see, what you hear, the lighting, the acoustics, the images that are projected around you change according to what you are doing. So on one hand, this is old. People have been doing this for centuries, meaning look at theater, for example, architecture. But what's different is we're using computers. We use computer media. So everything that we can modulate using a computer, we do. So it could be video that we project onto a wall, onto the floor, or the sounds that we put in surrounding of a certain field to give you some spatial sense using sound that you're somewhere else, right? That we do. Could also be something physical. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, we have used this for theatrical, artistic purposes, but always from the very, very beginning, from the get-go, the reason for this was to find ways to make our built environments, the environments we live in, more livable, not just more complicated and more fancy, but more livable. And that's been a really big question. So we start with the media, yes. And why do we use computers? Because computers are the way we control all sorts of things today. Right? So to the extent that the world is computerized, we use the computer to modulate our existing world. The other reason, that's a technical reason. The other reason is more maybe political, which is instead of telling stories, instead of, we could have our own experts tell the stories. We're experts at making these kinds of media. We can make, films, we can make 3D or games or whatever. But instead of that, the question is, what can we build and offer to people as media and instruments that everyone can use themselves? Make your own stories, not just seeing other people's stories, but making your own stories. So, and to be able to express yourselves as easily as we use our own voices. Can we do that? So it's taken many, many years, but we've developed a suite of such, we'll call them instruments, that allow people to make their own stories. And then the other part of the politics is to do this together, collectively. How can people make sense? How can we make sense of our lives in a way that where we can improvise? We can say, well, if we don't know the story ahead of time, we're making the story as we live, and we're making it together. After all, we're social people, right? People are social. So how can people make sense? How can people express themselves in all these different kinds of media environments in an improvisatory way is what we've been trying to build this responsive environments for. So that's another reason why it's so exciting to come together with UNDP to say, well, here's an opportunity to put this into practice. Now we have this kit of techniques. How can we offer this kit now to people who have something something very complicated, something very urgent situations to address, make sense of.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. And can you please give us a few practical examples of this work?
I'll give you two examples. Okay, one kind of more personal scale, and one which is more at the scale of a neighborhood or a city. Okay, the personal scale is work that we've been doing now for some years with music. So we're making these electronic instruments that you can wear. They can be quite cheap, things like this, which you can buy, for very little. But what we do is we create custom software and custom musical software that goes with it, so that people could be dancers, who could be kids, children, can jump and play around or dance in a rehearsed way, and the sound can be synthesized as you gesture and move. So this is created on the fly, not done from recordings. And why is that really of great potential? Is because this way you can sing with your gestures. People can nuance what they say, just as I can nuance my voice right now. Okay, whereas if you just were to see some words in a text, it wouldn't have that nuance, right? That spoken nuance. Or if you listen to a recording, it's somebody else's recorded nuance. It's not my voice, right? So these kinds of instruments are ways to allow people to express themselves now musically, okay, but in movement and gesture. We've been doing this now for many years, but we've recently begun to work with some schools serving autistic students who are autistic, who have, let's say, more neurodiverse ways of being in the world. And it's not that they are maybe less abled in certain kinds of ways, even in mathematics or science. They may be quite articulate. It's just that the way that they communicate and be in the world through the sensorium is quite different. So we're making now these kinds of instruments available to these more neurodiverse students, and showing them how they can make music together. And at the same time, they are learning something about computation and computational thinking, right? Because of COVID, this has become a lot more urgent. So in the United States, there are more than 60 million children in every country. Tens of millions of children suddenly, within a few weeks, were sent home. So we were all forced to watch our kids, or being forced to go to class through Zoom, through video conference. And now the pain point is quite obvious to every single parent around the world who's had to go through this, is that video conference is not the solution for this kind of activity. So this is where this is so important now, how to connect people together using gesture and speech. This is the personal. The bigger scale example is work we've been doing with some colleagues at Arizona State University, working on the models of weather and models of heat. So the American Southwest is, like many other places around that belt, experiencing severe heat conditions, which become even worse, of course. So we have colleagues who have done these kinds of models of the heat conditions, where we're looking at how the heat comes in from all directions. So as you walk around, it's not just the air temperature. The air temperature doesn't actually give the adequate sense of the felt experience of heat on the body. So those models are incredibly complicated. It could take hours or even days to compute this for something of the size of, let's say, Tempe or Phoenix, where the university is sitting. We also have sensor data. We measure this kind of radiant heat coming from all directions. The question is how to provide this kind of information to people, which is done in a scientific way, right? A God's eye, like a Google Earth map of the situation, which may not actually convey the felt experience, what it's actually like to walk around in such conditions. So what we've done is we've provided multiple ways of experiencing this kind of information. We can project it into the floor, we can project it into the air around you. We also have people walk around in a physical space as if they were walking outdoors, right? But without the full rigor of walking 10 miles. Like, we can make it appear as if you're walking across the city, and can give a theatrical sense of the felt experience of heat under those conditions at different times of day, different times of year. This is where we use our full-scale theatrical environments to give this kind of city in the bottle, right? To give a sense of this kind of environment in a compact way but still a felt way using our media environment techniques.
Thank you. Finally, Dr. Shah, what do you feel might be key barriers to organizations like UNDP or public sector more generally, governments included, in adopting an approach like alternative reality simulations as a standard way of stress testing their institutional resilience in face of uncertain and new risks?
There are strengths as well, which could also be part of the equation here. Okay, so first off, I guess the first thing that comes to my mind, which is probably pretty obvious, is that unlike a laboratory situation or academic situation, the UNDP doesn't have the luxury of saying, let's wait a bit, let's hold on, let's go back to the lab, the studio, think a little bit, come back with the answer. Don't have that luxury. Cannot stop activities or in order to keep on carrying out the mandate. Okay. So, and yet at the same time, you know, at least from the kind of interviews that Sander and I have done in our other project with UNDP, we also know there is a need for reflection. There is a need for reflecting on past projects to be able to learn from the know-how and the experiences and the social relationships, social capital that's been developed in one project and make it available somehow for a different project. Okay, Simon can speak more about these kinds of issues as we come over there. So there's this need for reflection and learning. Okay, at the same time, without stopping the practical question. And then with respect to the question of lab, if we want to prototype some alternative situations, whether it's social, economic, or technical, what are the choices? Either we do it in a lab, or a company does it in its labs, its private labs. But the only way to test it in those cases is to throw it over the wall, sell it, or release it, you know, and then see how it works, which can be extremely dangerous. Okay, have lots of economic, financial, and political risk attached to that. So the question will be, is there a way, can we develop ways to prototype these kinds of alternatives, whether it's an infrastructure or a device or an idea? How do we prototype these things in a way that's both authentic, so it has this kind of lived quality to it, this experiential authenticity to it. On the other hand, how to do it in a way that allows people to unmoor themselves from the immediate way things are done, which is always, you know, going to be, you know, locking us into certain ways of doing things. So that's a very big challenge, this idea of prototyping. How do we invent these kinds of techniques for prototyping situation? And then on the plus side, there's a tremendous body, and it's become very obvious to me and Sandra as we did our interviews, tremendous body of knowledge and experience and local knowledge, historical, cultural, political knowledge that UNDP already has in the various country offices and regional offices as well. So a lot of that knowledge, I think, is tacit. It's tacit. It's not written down. It'd be way too expensive to write it down. And once you write it down, it'd be obsolete. So I think that a big question is, how can we harness this kind of tacit knowledge, what's called tacit knowledge, which exists, it's real, but it's tacit, right? It's not written down. And how can we harness that kind of knowledge in a way that to make that knowledge available multi-generationally, and also available when UNDP is working with partners and peoples outside the UNDP. Like every organization, UNDP is so vast and so highly structured. There's a lot of inwardness built in to how people need to discover each other, find each other, build resources and biases. And sometimes it becomes very difficult to retain that kind of attitude of somebody who's not in UNDP. Again, I'm thinking that is another motivation for having some mechanisms, some social forms for prototyping the situation that engages these interlocutors and peoples and in the beneficiaries from the get-go.
We now turn to Sander. Thank you very much for being with us, Sander. You are currently collaborating with Dr. Shah on emerging needs for new capabilities that the international public sector ought to be well versed in if we're to provide cutting edge, relevant policy services to governments and other partners. Could you tell us a bit about what is emerging from that work?
Sure, I'd be happy to, but we're still in the middle of the project. So these are not in any way final results, but there are some thoughts behind it. First of all, and I think Xinwei's presentation has just touched on that in lots of ways, if we have to become much more flexible, and we don't have to think about a long-term future and strive for that because we know that that is going to be impossible in the first place, we actually need to start thinking about multiple futures. We need to start thinking about what is happening around us as full of the unexpected. And that basically means that one of the things I would argue that UNDP would really need to master is have a substantive number of people who are well versed in complex systems thinking. That's not so difficult to achieve. There are very interesting online courses to do that. And I think that's one basis, but there are not a lot of other bases. I think one of the real difficulties for anybody in a position like the people who are working in the field for UNDP is actually to make a link between the theoretical framework from which they're working and their actual practical experience in the field. That basically means that what we need to build is some educational means to familiarize people with that kind of difficulty, with the fact that different communities in different countries have different ways of looking at the world, and that those differences are not just superficial. They are absolutely fundamental and go very deep down in what their cultures are all about. And so we need to get people much better in sort of dealing with those kinds of differences and moving away from the sort of relatively linear and universal way of thinking that Western science has developed into much more anthropological thinking, into much more thinking about the sort of the not only just the cultural differences, but the emotional differences. I mean, one of the things that we feel is fundamental for UNDP to sort of develop is a way to have people to stimulate and help people develop their own ideas and to develop what they see as what is better and what they want. And I think too much of sort of development theory and development practice has actually gone in a direction of, well, our way is better. And that generally may work while the sort of Western person is present, but as soon as the Western person leaves, shows his back, usually these things flop and they don't get maintained. And so that is because they have not really built a platform that actually makes this something that the local population actually owns. Now that's just a couple of examples, and there are many. Adaptive management is a technique that has been developed quite a lot in ecology, for example, which I think is also very highly relevant. And innovation and entrepreneurship is a topic which also needs to be much more widely spread. But as I am talking about widely spread, I think underneath it all is that for the moment, UNDP does not have a real culture of capacity building. It is much too fragmented. People follow certain certifications. Many people that begin a certification don't actually end up completing it. I think what is needed is a real stimulus of a career structure that builds on people's capabilities, but also guides them in steps through acquiring the kinds of skills that are actually needed. And one element, for example, that we feel has not really had its place, and it touches very much on what Xinwei was saying up to now, is the whole idea of problem-based learning. What we have developed at ASU is we will take a problem that a company actually sort of dishes it up. And then we will get our graduate students to begin to look at that problem and to actually try and find their own solutions. The faculty is only there to guide them to resources, but the faculty is not in any way imposing what the end result should be or might be. That has a huge set of advantages. It gets students, and it would get personnel, UNDP personnel, to actually become politically astute and become good mediators. It would also confront them with a wide range of stakeholders. But I think even more important, it would be like them stepping into a deep pool and having to survive. And that is a technique which I think is actually really, really important in the kinds of situations that you're dealing with. So those are some of the results. We are designing that kind of capacity building structure, and at least proposing it. UNDP can see what it can do with it or not. And we are proposing then a series of certifications and courses that include some of these newer elements that we feel are absolutely essential if the organization is going to be able to deal with much more rapid change.
Sandra, thank you. In one of your lectures, you point out that we humans become more adept at short-term problem solving. We learn to shift the risk to long-term issues, such as climate change, which do not match the type of skills we have developed and know how to reward. So the tension between short-term and long-term thinking. In other words, it sounds like we are becoming victims of our own device. What type of institutional and societal change needs to happen in order to foster the long-term thinking of the type we also heard from Roland Gnarek at the opening panel of the dialogues? And how do approaches like alternative reality simulation help feed long-termism, more long-term thinking into our institutional fabric?
Let me first try and explain why you see this shift from towards shorter term thinking and longer term pushing away of problems. When we interact with the environment, whether it's a social environment or a natural environment, effectively we create in our minds a very reduced dimensionality, a very simplified and to some extent biased version of what we're actually observing. And that is then what steers us if we engage with that environment. And so whatever happens when we engage with that environment, we trigger unforeseen consequences. Now, if you project that over longer term time, you come to the idea that as societies operate in environments that they don't know or about things they don't know, they effectively sort of first see certain phenomena, and those are the ones that are most frequent. And so what we do is we begin to deal with those frequent challenges. Now, because of the much higher dimensionality of the environment itself, it actually means that we declare certain things to be signals and things to deal with, and other things we declare to be noise, that is, we're not going to look at it. As you see that over time, what effectively happens is that we, out of a total spectrum of frequency of phenomena, we actually only tackle the immediate ones. And we create problems, future problems, of which we don't know when they will occur or how they will occur. And so the future is always, to a large extent, determined by the unintended consequences of our behavior in the past and the present. And that is why I talk about this shift from short-term risks that we can deal with to long-term risks that we don't even know. And on top of that, those long-term risks, in the end, very often, end up a little bit like a sound barrier and I call it a risk barrier, which basically means that a whole bunch of risks suddenly come together, and then we really don't have a clue anymore how to solve them. So that is, I think, what is happening in the case of climate change and sustainability. It is one of those multidimensional problems of which climate change and CO2 emissions is only an infinitely small part. The problem is much, much, much bigger. So that about the phenomena. Now you ask me, what can we do to actually try and avoid that? And there are a number of different issues and things, some of them that I've already talked about. But I'll go a little bit further. I think one of the very fundamental things about our society is that when kids come into kindergarten or around there, the teachers are confronted with a double task. On the one hand, to develop those kids, and on the other hand, to socialize them. And many teachers do that by merging the two tasks, taking their victor, and effectively socializing the kids around particular ideas. And many of those ideas are being sold as truths. And I don't think they are. And I think what we should be doing, and this goes for those kids, but it in lots of ways also goes for us as adults, we should be aware that there are always alternatives, that there is never one solution, and that we need to think in those different alternatives and try and develop them. And I think that is where a lot of the complex systems approach actually does what we need to do. Now, how do you do that institutionally? That is, I think, a question of beginning to think about those multiple futures. And in anticipation of the next question, but also because I have heard Roman, and I can't pronounce his last name, in a TED talk about a project that I've been involved with in Japan, it gives some idea of how we might go out of that. This Japanese colleague, a man called Saijo, goes into a city, takes a sample of people, randomly selected, divides it into two, and then asks half of those people to conceive a future without saying more. And that basically means that what they try and do is they look from their present into the future. And then he takes the other half of the group and he tells them, look at as if you were your grandchildren and how they would see the world. And the interesting thing, and he's done this in a number of places in Japan, but also in Bangladesh and other places, is that the ideas that come out are completely different. And that the people who are asked to displace themselves into the future come up with much more creative, alternative futures and thinking out of the box than we actually do when we are bound in our scientific or even our cultural way of thinking, which is very, very much a linear one, a reductionist one. And another aspect of that is that our thinking is generally in oppositions. We think about entities, about units, and we contrast them. We have a concept and we take the opposite concept, and then they say one and the other cannot be united. That is something, for example, which in the Far East is not at all part of the normal philosophy, because the opposites are always considered to be part of the same thing. So you actually get very, very different ways of thinking. And my own intuition is that we have to move to the kinds of things that Xinhui is doing. And in those alternate reality simulations, try and insert some of those kinds of thinking. And that is why I insist on the sort of problem-based learning, the field experience and things like that, because what you are faced with when you get involved in something like that is of such a huge complexity that one of the things that becomes very, very clear almost off the bat is that there isn't a single silver bullet, but that it is actually a very, very complex set of things that needs to be not even dissembled, but that needs to be analyzed from very many different perspectives.
Having heard from our two distinguished partners, we now turn to my colleague, Ida, from UNDP Vietnam Country Office. Ida, you come from one of the 7 UNDP offices who worked on designing and running the alternate reality city-based simulation. Can you give us a bit of a sense about the experience of taking part in the simulation, both good and bad?
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. So I think, the participating and designing the simulation has definitely been a very interesting process for us. It's definitely something we've never done before. So a lot of new learning, a lot of new insights as to how do we approach this type of an experiment. And I guess for us, it's really forced us to rethink some of the trends that we see happening in Vietnam. When we were designing some of those chronic conditions and some of those trends or events, we kind of really started to rethink as to how do we see Vietnam's development trajectory. And so it's been really interesting even then to think about some of those black swan events to become actual major events and disruptions for Hanoi. And I think, of course, in the current context, it's super relevant. And even Vietnam, Vietnam has handled the current COVID pandemic extremely well. We've had very few cases comparatively, and we've been able to live normal lives. But regardless, I think what's interesting is that when combined with other trends and events, adding layer of complexity to the situation, we really hope to see some interesting responses from participants playing different roles in the simulation. And so this is something that we're expecting to see because there are no preconditions, there are no designed reactions or plans for these types of complex emergencies. So we're really excited to see how that plays out. So it's been a very interesting experiment for us so far, and the team is very excited to see how it unravels on the day.
What are the events you encoded into Hanoi simulation, and how did you attract external partners to be part of the experience?
Yeah, it's a good question. So kind of how we started thinking about it is that we kind of went back. We started thinking, what are the past events? What are the past kind of disruptions for the city and for Vietnam, broadly speaking? And we started identifying kind of disasters and trends on different domains from previous pandemics, such as the SARS, to, of course, impacts of climate change with increased storms and floods, different economic crises from the past. And then we started to kind of think, what if we look forward? Kind of, as I mentioned before, we've been starting to think where is Vietnam going? What are the trajectories and what are the potential? Would these crises perhaps come back? In what form? Will they kind of accelerate? What kind of new dynamics would there be at play? What are the things that we couldn't foresee perhaps happening in Vietnam? So we really started to think outside the box as well as to what it could look like. So we have a lot of different types of crises that we've introduced as potential ones, and we've kind of taken this as a emerging exercise in a way. We will only know at the actual simulation which of these crises that we've planned will actually take place, but we will have different crises, different trends from different domains: economic, climate related, government, kind of institutional disruptions, etc. And of course, these different events and trends really play out very differently when you look them through different players. So that's going to be really interesting for us. And naturally, a natural partner for us in this journey has been the National Economics University. So we've invited our external partners from there, as it happens to be really timely for us. We organized a 5-day training of trainers course actually for the National Economics University and government think tanks on anticipatory governance and strategic foresight just last week. So we're really excited to have them join here because it's kind of part of this learning journey we're going through them as to how do you start introducing these concepts in the government and what would that take. And this kind of for us has really started from this concept of anticipatory, agile and adaptive governance, which we see really as central to creating an ecosystem which could undertake actions to address development challenges while dealing with complexity. So this is really something that we've been started to work years ago already. Last year we had, just before COVID, we had our workshop where we had our partners join as well. And so we've been really kind of trying to continue the dialogue and introduce these new types of approaches with our national partners.
Thank you, Ida. Very interesting. One more question. Your work in Vietnam has positioned UNDP as a go-to partner for anticipatory governance. What do you think would make these types of methods easier to permeate larger bureaucracies, so go beyond UNDP and actually work with the government on that?
Thanks very much for the question. And as said, like the concept of anticipatory governance for us has very much from the beginning echoed kind of the AAA function, the mentality of that. So it's not only anticipatory, but agile and adaptive as well. And what this really means is that for us, we've kind of thought it as requiring new types of capabilities from the government. So for us, it really needs the ability to identify the landscapes of change, which is kind of the strategic foresight component, but then uses in an organizationally useful ways. It requires systemic thinking and systems thinking in an inter-organizational cooperation to mobilize the ecosystems to address these types of wicked and complex interdependencies that these development challenges portray. And then finally, it requires a cultural and structural shift and institutional innovation that supports experimentation to drive learning, which can then be scaled for impact. So this is something that we've been promoting, and we've been kind of supporting our government partners to start adopting in different ways. So at least from UNDP Vietnam's perspective, we've been working on both national and city levels in terms of introducing these concepts. At the national level, we've been working with the Party's Theoretical Council, which is in charge of the strategy setting for the country. We've been working, of course, with the National Economics University, creating a curriculum and a training course for policymakers. And at the city level, we've been really working with the City Lab in Da Nang as to looking at how do we address complex development challenges better in a more anticipatory manner and more agile manner at the city level. And that's where this exercise is actually very interesting, because we're looking at the same questions around challenges facing and complex emergencies facing cities. So what we've found out, I guess, is that part of it is to take our government partners through this journey with us. So through experimentation, for example, in Da Nang, we've been showing and kind of making the case for experimenting and how to translate that into policy. And this was specifically for, in our case, on waste. And we've been trying to bring these different connections as well with different kind of ministries, and we've been really trying to embody this inter-organizational cooperation and interministerial collaboration to bring as a kind of in the forefront. But it's really kind of one of these things that for many governments, many local governments especially, it's something that they need to see themselves. So we kind of been taking this more of an action-oriented approach to introducing these approaches to our government partners.
Finally, as a wrap-up question, can you just share with us 1 2 insights from this experience that you think should inform UNDP's own long-term thinking, the UNDP's new strategic plan?
Right. So this question, I think, and the way we've been thinking about it, is that while we're advising our governments, while we are supporting to develop their capacity on being more anticipatory, agile, and adaptive, we also need to take a look at ourselves we kind of need to start from ourselves in terms of looking at how can we as UNDP be more anticipatory, adaptive, and agile. So I think this is a key insight for the new strategic plan, which of course introduces a set of questions as to how to do that. So we've been starting to think around, for example, designing portfolios or moving towards a portfolio of interventions instead of individual projects and single point solutions. But then thinking, what would this mean in practice? What are the implications for management? What are the implications for finance? And how do we transition from the current state to be more adaptive, be more dynamic? And then how do we manage this dynamic and emergent portfolio, which to us, which we're thinking that does require a new culture and practice of management and new types of integrated teams. And so a lot of the questions we've been exploring in regarding to this is as part of our deep demonstrations work at the country office level as to how do we create the preconditions for experimenting within UNDP, but also then taking these learnings and working with the government for them to do the same thing. So I would say this is the main insight. How do we kind of start introducing these new approaches both within UNDP and with our government partners?
Time has come to close it. Today we heard from the panel about the ways in which complexity research and novel ways of addressing wicked problems can make a difference at the local level, amplifying the work of UNDP and other players on the ground. We take away that the future of development requires us to design and collaborate in more responsive environments, built through smart amalgamation of sensors, stories, modeling, and constant feedback loops. In the real world setting of a UNDP country office, this means shifting to problem-based learning, adaptive management, less prescriptive and more anthropological thinking, finding ways to express rich tacit knowledge that teams on the ground possess. And finally, this means a new culture of capacity building within UNDP, within the UN, and also with our partners. One such key partner for UNDP is cities, and the first ever alternative reality simulation exercise, which UNDP carried out with the Arizona State University in a number of cities globally, including Hanoi, from which we heard today, challenges us all, decision makers, practitioners, academics, to rethink what we mean by urban development and urban resilience. The set of techniques applied in the simulation helps us look at how unforeseen risks can affect well-being and how cities, as live ecosystems, I would dare say, can both suffer and prosper, depending on how they adaptively manage based on weak or strong signals and nudges. I know from my practical experience in the region, most recently with the UNDP team in Armenia, that the demand for such capabilities to manage risk, to manage unforeseen circumstances, is growing within governments in the region and beyond, and that we need to be able to put together very specific programs and partnership to help meet this demand. Hope that today's session gave us some pointers on how such partnerships and such programs might look, and that you found it useful. And in closing, I'd like to thank our speakers, Dr. Shah, Dr. van der Leeuw, and Ms. Usikula, for their time and for their insights. Thank you.